That evening, at a centuries-old villa by Lake Como, the elite gathered for a private auction where an unlabeled bottle of wine was rumored to have the power to rewrite the history of European viticulture. Everyone came armed with business cards, connections, and gold-inked invitations. And then a woman walked in, carrying nothing but a linen tote bag and a name that had been erased from the industry 80 years ago. They laughed at her. They stopped her at the door. They thought she was simply lost. But when she placed her hand on that bottle, the entire room fell silent, as if history itself had just sighed. And with just one question, she made some of the wealthiest people in Europe lower their heads because for the first time in their lives, they realized there are things that cannot be auctioned. Lake Como, Italy. An early autumn afternoon. Inside Villa Moresca, a former residence of a Lombardy nobleman, the crystal chandeliers were already lit before sunset. Polished leather shoes echoed against marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of cedarwood cologne and aged grape wine. This was not a place where people came to drink. It was a place where people came to prove they were worthy of drinking. There was no printed guest list. Invitations were handwritten, sealed with wax, and delivered through intermediaries so discreet that even personal assistants dared not ask their names. The entire auction was announced with a single line, an unlabeled bottle from a bloodline that no longer exists. And then she walked in. A woman in a light grey sweater, the cuffs slightly rolled to reveal fraying threads. No jewelry, no lipstick, no assistant trailing behind. Just a faded canvas bag slung across her shoulder and a calm gaze as if she had come to repay a debt owed to time itself. No one knew her name, and no one bothered to ask. A young man in a pale suit glanced at his friend and smirked. Did someone's maid get lost? She probably thinks it's a free tasting for TikTok. She heard them, but she didn't react. She simply walked, slow, steady each step, as if she remembered the ground beneath her feet. The man checking the guest list paused when he saw her. "I'm sorry I don't see your name in the registry." "I wasn't invited," she replied softly, "but I received a message." "From whom?" "Gervais Moreau." The air caught in a single breath. That was a name that wasn't supposed to be spoken here. No one laughed anymore. But still, they didn't let her in. And so Isabelle Moreau stood there, simple, silent, and unknown to all. That she was the very reason this night existed. Isabelle was still standing there in the marble-clad reception hall where the chandelier's light reflected in people's eyes like a silent appraisal. The man in charge of the guest list maintained a professional expression, but his lips pressed together as if weighing politeness against the dignity of the auction. "You said, Mr. Gervais Moreau." The question slipped out quiet, but sharp enough to perk up a few ears nearby. Isabelle nodded, her gaze unwavering. "He sent me a message 10 years ago. I'm afraid Mr. Moreau passed away a long time ago, and tonight's list isn't open to the unverified." The moment the sentence ended, laughter echoed from the staircase. 3 men and 1 woman, young, fashionable, clearly familiar from other parties. One of them stepped forward, a perfectly fitted white shirt sleeves rolled neatly, a Patek Philippe glinting at his wrist. "Come on, Quentin. Don't be rude. She probably just walked into the wrong event. Or maybe she's looking for the kitchen." No, the woman added, dragging her words into a smirk. "She's right. Moreau. Sounds like a comic book character. Thought that name had gone extinct." This time Isabelle didn't stay silent. "Actually, that name used to be printed on over 3,000 bottles of wine every season, long before any of your families planted their first vines." The words were soft as a breeze, but sharp as a razor. The man blinked, mouth half open, preparing to fire back, but an older gentleman had just entered interrupting with a solemn voice. "She is allowed in." Gervais listed her name in the old records. Everyone turned. It was Mr. Belardi, the founder of the auction house, one of only 3 men known to have tasted the legendary wine that no one dared to name aloud. He stepped forward and offered a slight bow. "Miss Moreau, please come in, and thank you for being here." Behind her, the younger group remained frozen stunned, as if they had just watched an ancient map begin to glow. What they didn't know was that from that very moment, the air of the evening had already started to change. Inside the main hall, beneath a vaulted ceiling, hand-painted with pure gold leaf, more than 40 guests were seated on velvet chairs, scattered in quiet clusters. Each person had a name, a title, and a brand behind them. The faint clinking of glasses echoed softly, but every ear was waiting for the sound of the first gavel strike. At the center of the room stood a small ebony podium, bathed in its own spotlight. There was no champagne opener, no introduction of trending wine labels. The host made a simple announcement. "We'll begin right away. Only one item will be auctioned tonight, and it is the final piece from La Maison Gervais." No one spoke. No one dared to disturb the silence. This was no longer just an auction, it had become a ritual. A staff member, wearing white gloves, walked out and carefully placed an aged, unlabeled bottle onto the podium. The glass was dark, almost like obsidian. The cork had browned with age. No one knew exactly what it was, and that was precisely why they came. No description, no vintage year, no tasting notes. All we know is that this bottle was discovered in Mr. Gervais Moreau's wine cellar in 1944. And no one knows how it was hidden. A whisper rippled through the room like an underground current. Isabel sat in the last row, her eyes locked on the bottle, unblinking. A man in a red suit, likely an investor from New York, let out a low whistle. "Nice story, but who's verifying it's real?" Isabel stood up. No permission asked. No hesitation. She walked straight to the podium so softly that the staff barely had time to react. She stopped in front of the bottle and bowed her head. She didn't touch it, just studied it. Then with a single, deliberate motion, she tilted the bottle to a very specific angle, raising its base into the golden light. Every eye followed. She gently touched a small groove, one no one had noticed, and wiped it clean with a silk cloth she had brought. A symbol appeared. A hand-engraved aster flower. Immediately, an elderly man near the front stood up, stunned. "My God, it's real." A dark-skinned woman from Morocco teared up and whispered, "He once told me there were only 3 bottles with that mark. One was lost in the war. One burned. So, this is..." Isabel still didn't turn around. She simply spoke softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is the last bottle my grandfather ever made, before they forced him to sign over everything. And he hid it inside a wall, because no one should ever put a price on legacy." The room fell utterly silent, not because of the wine, but because they had just realized the quiet woman standing before them was the last person alive who carried the truth they all believed had been buried. The air in the room had turned heavy. There were no more whispers, no more polite smiles. The eyes of those who once sat tall and proud now lowered as if they were seated in front of an unspoken indictment. Isabel was still standing there. Her hands were steady, her gaze unshaken. "I didn't come here to trade," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I came to return a name one this industry has erased from its labels for nearly a century." It wasn't an accusation. It was a declaration. Not angry, not loud, but sharper than any rebuttal could ever be. A man in the front row, An Italian wine magnate slowly set down his glass and stood. He looked up at her for a long moment, then nodded. I remember. In 1983, I once heard Gervais say, when they forced me to sign someone else's name onto my wine, I wasn't angry. I was afraid that one day they would forget I ever existed. He turned toward the bottle. I think today is the day he's remembered again. Like a father finally being allowed to sign his name on his own child. Down below, the young experts from earlier had their heads bowed. None dared meet her eyes. The woman who once mocked Isabel had quietly stepped back, gripping the strap of her purse, like she was searching for balance. Then a sound rose from the back of the room, the sound of Mr. Bellardi standing. He walked slowly to the podium, holding a worn, leather-bound document. We've kept an unofficial copy of Gervais' will. It wasn't filed formally, but it carries his seal. There's a handwritten line in the margin. He paused, opened the page, and read aloud to the entire room. If one day the girl finds this bottle, let her decide whether this industry still deserves to exist for another generation. It was only then that Isabel turned around, her eyes shimmering with a quiet emotion, not easily named but deeply felt. She looked slowly around the room. Her gaze was no longer gentle, it was piercing, as if reading into every face. Then she asked in a voice not raised but impossible to ignore, among everyone here, has anyone ever tasted a single drop of wine my grandfather made with his own hands? She paused. If not, then what gives you the right to set its price? No one answered, not because they didn't hear her, but because there were no words that could restore a value already stolen. And it was that silence, not an apology, that marked the beginning of everything yet to come. Mr. Bellardi was still standing there, holding the copy of the will with both hands. But now, he wasn't looking at the document anymore. He was looking at Isabel as if for the first time in his life he had seen a true heir. Ladies and gentlemen, he said slow and clear, I must confirm no one here has ever tasted this wine. No one was ever invited into Moreau's cellar, and no one has ever witnessed the ancient fermentation process he used. He raised his head and looked at each person in turn. So is it not true that Isabel Moreau is not only the sole keeper of the truth, but also the only one entrusted to carry it forward? A silver-haired man representing a global wine investment fund spoke up. If she has proof of ownership, then legally, this auction must be halted. Isabel said nothing. She simply placed an old leather satchel on the table, opened it, pulled out a small wooden box with a brass lock. It wasn't the kind of box meant for jewelry, it wasn't glamorous, but when she opened it, everyone held their breath. Inside was Gervais Moreau's seal ring, the aster flower symbol hand-carved, and a sheet of original parchment, the actual will. Not a copy, not typed, signed in violet ink with a fingerprint sealed in blood. The mood in the room changed instantly. I've kept it since I was a child, Isabel said. My grandfather didn't trust lawyers. He trusted his cellar, and I am the last person alive who knows the code to open it. One of the auction officials leaned toward Bellardi and whispered, Sir, if this document is real, the entire estate of Maison Gervais will need to be re-examined, including brands currently using the original formulas. Bellardi frowned slightly, then turned to Isabel. What do you want? That question rang through the room, like an official acknowledgement. No longer, who invited you here, but now, you have the right. You have the authority to decide. Isabel looked at the bottle on the podium, silent for a moment, then replied, I don't want to sell it. I want everyone to remember that some things were created to be passed on, not passed around. Murmurs stirred. Some stood up from their seats. Others pulled out their phones, to call legal advisors. A few investors left the room entirely, and just then, an elderly woman in a deep violet velvet dress rose from her chair. She was the CEO of one of the largest wine houses in Europe. She stepped onto the podium, looked Isabel in the eye, and then knelt down on one knee before her. "I was the last intern your grandfather ever taught to check viscosity by candlelight. I've been silent too long. Today, I want to say I'm sorry. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to help restore the name Moreau to the place it truly deserves." No one dared to laugh anymore, because the auction was over. But something far greater had just begun. The room felt almost frozen. Everyone understood the power had shifted toward Isabel, but not everyone was ready to accept that. And so he spoke up. The young man in the pale suit, the one who had mocked her at the start, stepped into the spotlight, clapping slowly. "I must say, you know how to spin a story, Mademoiselle Moreau. Memories, symbols, and a family heirloom ring. Very touching." He approached the podium, nodded to Mr. Bellardi, then turned to Isabel with a half smile. "But if this bottle is truly the last one, the relic your grandfather left behind, then why not open it right now? Let the world see what's real and what isn't." Some in the room began to shift. A few nodded. It seemed they wanted a result, wanted to prove whether this so-called meaning was actually worth anything. Mr. Bellardi frowned. "Mr. Darian, this isn't I only want confirmation," Darian interrupted. "We're rewriting history here based on a bottle no one's dared to taste." He turned to Isabel, voice edged with challenge. "What's the matter? Are you afraid, or do you already know? If we open it, it's just an ordinary old wine." Isabel didn't move. She looked at him for a long time, not angry, not condescending. Then she did something no one expected. She stepped down from the podium, walked straight up to Darian, and handed him the bottle. The room held its breath. "If you believe you understand wine," she said calmly, "then go ahead. Open it. But I ask just one thing. Don't open it like a victor. Open it like someone who understands what it means to lose something." Darian froze. His hand touched the bottle's neck. His eyes scanned the room, the cameras were rolling, everyone was watching. But he didn't open it. His hand dropped. I don't think I have the right." Isabel nodded. "Thank you. That's the one thing no one has had the courage to say in 80 years. Now the entire room fell silent. No one was talking price anymore. No one mentioned the auction. Because everyone had just witnessed something rare. Power does not lie in material value. It lies in whether you are worthy of holding it. Darian stepped back to his seat, silent. No one clapped, but there was no need to. The entire room had just learned a lesson, not through grand speeches, but through the hesitation in his hands. Isabel returned to the podium. She gently placed the bottle back in its original spot, then pulled out a velvet cloth and carefully draped it over like one would tuck in a loved one who had fallen into peaceful sleep. Mr. Bellardi stepped beside her. He looked around the room. "This auction is officially closed. But I believe there's one thing that still needs to be decided." He turned to Isabel. Not as a host, but as a man representing an entire industry now bowing its head to history. "You didn't come to sell. We understand. But if you choose to continue the journey of Maison Moreau, you won't be able to do it alone. There will be those who want to buy and shape it and control it. You'll need allies." Isabel looked at him then, at the room faces that had once brimmed with arrogance, now waiting for her to say something, anything so they might begin to make amends. Then from the back, an older woman stood. It was Madame Marguerite Allard, former director of the Bordeaux Institute of wine research. She rose with the aid of a cane, walking slowly but firmly toward the front. I was the one who signed the document, rejecting Gervais' formula as insufficiently verified. I was wrong, not because we lacked evidence, but because we were afraid to validate a truth that came from a family exiled from the commerce circle. She stopped before Isabelle. If you are willing, I'd like to offer the use of the Institute's former headquarters in Dijon, not as an office, but as a living museum, a place where people can taste, learn, and understand wine, not through its label, but through its story. A soft murmur rippled through the room. This was no longer an auction. It had become a proposal to rebuild the legacy with bare hands. Isabelle remained silent for a moment. Then she nodded. I accept, but with one condition. The room held its breath. No wine bearing the name Moreau will ever be produced as a collector's item. No replicas, no limited editions. They will be drunk together, at tables, among real people. No famous names will be printed on the label except the name of the person who actually made the wine. One of the organizers let out a low whistle. So, no brand? Isabelle smiled. No, a drinkable memory. And with that one nod, she didn't just redefine the value of a single bottle of wine. She redefined how we understand legacy itself. A month later, in the quiet countryside near Dijon, something rare was seen. A line of people of all ages, farmers, students, artists, chefs, even elderly women with silver hair, waiting outside a small restored stone house turned into a winery. There were no signs, no banners, just a handwritten board hanging at the entrance. Today we open the first bottle. If you've ever been judged by how you look, come in. We'll pour you a glass. We don't sell. Inside the rustic stone room, Isabelle personally wiped every glass and opened each bottle by hand. There were no cameras, no reporters, only the sounds of people listening to each other, sharing stories that had once been dismissed or forgotten. In another corner, Madame Marguerite Allard was speaking to a young woman. Wine has two parts. One part ferments from grapes, the other from memory. The first takes time. The second takes acknowledgement. At first, the international press was puzzled. There were no price tags, no brands to invest in, no media campaigns granted access. But then something strange happened. The people who had attended the auction began to retell the story freely, not through headlines, but through whispers, at dinner tables, in quiet gatherings, at tiny wine tastings tucked into back streets. And that story spread like a slow-working yeast, not loud, but unstoppable. A year later, at a major wine conference in Switzerland, when the organizers announced the award for Outstanding Heritage Revival, the name Isabelle Moreau was read aloud. No one came forward. The host looked confused. Then a short, handwritten letter was delivered, written on coarse parchment. Legacy doesn't need trophies. It only needs to be shared at a table where no one is looked down on for not knowing how to describe the finish. If I had to choose between a wine that earns applause and one that makes someone feel they matter, I'd choose the second glass. And that evening, in a small village in France, Isabelle sat at a wooden table surrounded by strangers. Each person brought a story. None of them knew she had once won a grand auction. They only knew she was the woman who poured wine slowly with both hands. A boy around 8 years old ran around the table, eyeing the wine glasses of the adults. Isabelle bent down and handed him a ripe grape instead. "What is this?" he asked. "It's what makes wine," she said, smiling. "If you let it ripen long enough." He sniffed at eyes, lighting up smells like sunshine. Isabelle smiled gently. That's because it was aged underground. Underground. Why bury it? the boy asked. Because the most precious things usually need time in the dark to become something worthy. Like a fairy tale, she said. The boy nodded, then ran off, and left at the table were the adults, sitting still, drinking more slowly. People tend to think that any story about dignity, if it ends at all, must end with triumph, with a room full of bowed heads, with a name restored, with a round of belated applause for the one who was once left on the margins. And perhaps, for many, that would be enough. But if you've ever carried a wound across 3 generations, you'll understand the truth doesn't just need to be recognized. It needs to be cared for, not with stage lights, but with real hands, real earth, and real time. Isabel had made the entire room fall silent. She reclaimed a legacy simply by refusing to let go of the last bottle. But that was only one part of the story, because somewhere else, with the same name, the same bottle, and the same woman, a different kind of return was quietly taking place. No auction, no audience, no bowed heads, just an old wine cellar, a notebook with ink faded by time, and a promise whispered to the dead, "I won't let what you left behind become something people try to price." If you think the story is over, perhaps you've only read half the label. Not everyone spends 10 years staring at a bottle of wine without ever opening it. Not because they forget, but because they remember too clearly. In the stretch of land between Dijon and Beaune, hidden behind a vineyard of dead vines, there's an old stone house. Every morning, a faint light shines from the cellar behind that house. No one asks questions. No one gets too close. Inside lives a woman named Isabel. No one knows what she does for a living. They just know she lives alone. No social media, no production license, no advertisements, except for one daily ritual. She goes down into the cellar to wipe dust off a single unlabeled bottle of wine. One bottle, 10 years, never opened. Rumors say she has psychological issues. Others believe it's a relic from some tragic love story. Some say bluntly she probably thinks it's priceless. One day it'll just explode and be done. No one really knows. She didn't keep the bottle to drink it. She kept it so she wouldn't forget. Because it was the last remaining trace of a name the wine industry tried to bury nearly 80 years ago, Gervais Moreau. A label once printed on thousands of bottles each year, then erased as if it had never existed. Her grandfather used to say, "They can take the name off the label, but if you can still remember the taste, they haven't won." And she kept that memory not through protest, not through confrontation, but through presence. She didn't carry the wine out into the world. She waited until the wine found its name again on its own. Not everyone understands why someone would spend 10 years looking at a bottle of wine without ever opening it. But for Isabel, walking down into that cellar each day wasn't repetition. It was continuation. As if her grandfather had just climbed those same steps yesterday and left behind one final breath she was still preserving in silence. In the western corner of the cellar, next to a warped wooden shelf, sagging with damp, was a small wooden box where she kept his notebook. The cover was peeling, the page edges scorched, the ink faded, but the handwriting remained the distinct slant of Gervais, the man who handwrote all his blending formulas because he didn't trust typewriters. Fermentation date second waning moon after the first spring rain. The soil this year smells more of rotting leaves. Reduce the oak concentration. If strain L12 ripens late, don't force it into the commercial calendar. Let it follow memory. At the very end of the book was a torn page, but Isabel had memorized what was left. After the war, the big houses returned to Bourgogne. They formed brand alliances, unified grape strains, and standardized alcohol content. I refused to sign. They called me a romantic. Then they stopped calling. They simply erased. Isabel had read that line over and over in silence, not because it hurt, but because it was still there. Some names once crossed out from official records die instantly. But the name Moreau, even when no one spoke it aloud, was like a seed buried deep. It only needed one person who remembered how to plant it. She had once asked her grandfather on a summer night without electricity under the flicker of candlelight in the cellar, "What is L12, Grandpa?" He had placed a hand on her head and answered with words she would never forget. L12 is a grape that was never given a name because no one backed it. It grows a bit slow, ripens a bit late, and it's not uniform the way people like, but it survives the cold well. And if you wait for the right year, the right moon, it gives off a scent no other grape can imitate. The thing is, it refuses to cooperate with anyone in a hurry. From that moment on, L12 was no longer just a grape in a footnote. It became a reminder of something forgotten, not because it lacked quality, but because it refused to follow the trend of the times, just like her grandfather. And if she didn't remember, then no one would. It was raining lightly. Isabel was wiping the neck of the bottle with a cloth when she heard 3 knocks on the door. Not hurried, not urgent. They sounded as if the person outside didn't need to come in, only needed to know that someone inside was still holding on to something that hadn't yet been told. She opened the door. A middle-aged man stood there, slim-build, salt-and-pepper hair, holding a leather bag, darkened by the rain. He didn't waste words, didn't offer a business card. He simply said, "I've come from Turin. I was an apprentice to Carlo Marchetti Gervais' last student." Isabel paused for a second. Then she stepped aside, not because he deserved it, but because her grandfather once told her, "If someone comes for the wine, close the door. But if they come for what the wine was meant to preserve, at least pour them a light." They sat across from each other in the small kitchen. Between them was the unlabelled bottle. The man didn't touch it. "You've come to put a price on it?" Isabel asked. "No, I came to understand why you haven't opened it." She didn't respond right away. The yellow light from the overhead lamp reflected off the stone tabletop, casting a soft glow on the brown-tinged scratch at the bottle's neck. "Because if I open it," she said, "it becomes just another bottle of wine. But right now, it's still a possibility. Something not yet defined by taste or critic scores." She placed her hand on the bottle's neck so lightly it didn't leave a print. "I don't keep the wine to drink it. I keep it to remember that someone once dared not to sell it." The man slowly opened his leather bag and took out a small item wrapped in coarse cloth. A fragment of a wine label, one corner charred. The aster flower was missing half its petals. The word Moreau was sliced mid-letter. "I found it in a burned-out cellar near Lyon. The owner was Carlo's cousin. They used to keep a few Moreau bottles quietly, like hiding old love letters." He looked up, his voice softer now. "I once saw a bottle of Moreau in my grandfather's cabinet. When he passed, I opened it out of curiosity, but I don't remember the taste. I only remember he always said never to touch it unless the candle was lit." Isabel nodded gently. "Then you already understand." She looked at the bottle. "I don't keep it because it's rare. I keep it because of the light my grandfather wanted around it." The man stayed silent. He didn't nod. He didn't argue. He simply remained there for a few more minutes, as if there was still a third presence in the room, not in body, but in memory. The next morning, while the mist still clung to the tiled roof, 2 men knocked on Isabel's door. One, she already knew the man from Turin. The other was new, a younger Parisian accent, crisp shirt shoes, untouched by soil. He looked like someone always ready to step into a presentation. He carried a slim leather portfolio and a smile that wasn't exactly fake. It was just too prepared, too carefully shaped, not to offend anyone. "I'm from a European Agronomic Heritage Restoration Fund," he said, pulling a full-color brochure from his case. "We've heard you may be holding part of the Moreau legacy. If that's true, I believe there's potential for collaboration." Isabel didn't answer right away. She invited them into the kitchen, poured hot water, and sat down. She let him unfold his proposal across the old wooden table, its cracks bearing the weight of time itself. "You see here," he pointed at the diagram. "If we can restore the vineyard, we can apply for a special geographic indication status. And if we add a tourist route paired with narrative-driven AR storytelling, people won't just remember the Moreau brand, they'll pay to be moved by it." Isabel furrowed her brow. "How much are you pricing a story that was buried for 80 years? He hesitated just for a moment, but quickly recovered with a gentle, diplomatic smile. "It's not pricing, it's translating value into a language this generation understands." Isabel looked at the digital schematic. There were vineyard blocks, visitor routes, even a virtual simulation of the wine cellar. She folded the paper. Not abruptly, not rudely, just like someone closing a book they never intended to finish. "My grandfather didn't leave wine for people to experience. He left it for those patient enough to wait until it ripens and quiet enough to hear what it's trying to say." The young man was silent. He wasn't offended, just confused, as if hearing for the first time a kind of answer he had no slide prepared for. The man from Turin stood up. "I think we should give her some space." They left. But just before stepping through the gate, the young man turned around, a little hesitant. "You know," he said, "if you change your mind, the door is still open." Isabel replied softly, just enough for the wind to carry it away. "I don't need the door to stay open. I just need my grandfather's name to be called again. The right way." 3 days later, Isabel and the man from Turin returned to the old land, the place that once was the Moreau family vineyard. That soil hadn't been turned in decades, not because it was forbidden, but because no one believed there was anything left worth finding. The weather was still, a gentle breeze. Morning sunlight slanted across the fields, casting long shadows even from the weeds, as if someone's hand was pointing the way. Isabel said nothing the entire way. She brought with her a notebook wrapped in linen, its first page marked with a dried grapevine sprig. On that page was a drawing by her grandfather, not a map, no coordinates, just a series of strange symbols, 3 overlapping curves, a single violet-colored line, and one slanted note written in his hand: "Don't look with your eyes. Listen with the soles of your feet." They walked through the brittle furrows, no fences, no markers. Isabel took off her shoes and walked barefoot. She wasn't scanning the ground, she was moving, as if gathering old sounds buried in the roots of the grass. At a shallow dip in the earth, where the grass grew thinner and the wind reversed its direction, she stopped. She knelt down and placed her hand on the soil, not listening with her ears, but with her palm. And there's something very specific emerged in the silence, not emptiness, but the kind of quiet that belongs to a place where someone once waited for someone else to return. The man from Turin opened his pack and pulled out an iron soil probe. After just a few tries, the rod sank straight down as if the ground had given way. He looked at Isabel, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Here," he murmured. Isabel nodded. She didn't smile. "My grandfather used to say, a cellar doesn't need a door. It needs someone quiet enough to hear it." That afternoon, they began to dig. No excavators, just a shovel, bare hands, and time. Beneath the dry surface were hand-cut stones, not square, not even, but fitted so precisely It felt like someone had placed them with the intent of never being found. At the center lay a round slab of stone with a small ring of rusted brass and a shallow engraving. The letter G, quiet, like the first letter of a sentence, never spoken aloud. Around the edge was a carving of the aster flower worn, but still clear enough to show that it had never forgotten anyone who once stepped inside. Isabel didn't open it. She laid a white cloth over the stone and placed a dried grapevine in the center. "We'll open it on the full moon. My grandfather always said, the things that truly matter should be seen in full light." Turin nodded. They didn't walk away like people who had uncovered a secret. They stepped back like people standing before an old room where memory still breathed. Full moon night. There was no one there but Isabel. The man from Turin had offered to come with her, but she declined. Not out of secrecy, but because some doors, when opened in front of too many people, lose the quiet they need to be truly heard. She brought with her an oil lamp, a piece of linen cloth, and an old notebook folded into the shape of an envelope. On the cover, she had written in pencil, "Not to open for discovery, to open for remembrance." The moon that night wasn't brilliant, but it stood high enough to cast the shadow of every blade of grass, long across the stone. When she lifted the white cloth and gently removed the dried grapevine, the stone still held a trace of warmth from the moonlight, as if it had been waiting to be touched. She placed her hand on the brass ring and waited for one breath. Then she pulled gently. A low sound rose, not mechanical, but more like the first exhale of a room that had forgotten how to speak. The first scent wasn't of wine. It was the scent of stone, breathing in the dark. She lit the lamp and stepped down one stair at a time. The space below wasn't deep, but the air changed with each step, cool, quiet, dense, like a slow piece of music waiting for its first note. At the bottom was a domed stone chamber. No barrels, no shelves, only a single low table at the center, and on it, one object, a small notebook, encased in aged glass. Isabel sat down, but didn't open it right away. She took the linen cloth and gently wiped the glass. Beneath the dust, the handwriting was slanted, the ink violet untouched by time, as if it had waited unblurred. "If you've found this place, it means no one has yet bought what I believed could never be priced. Don't rebuild the name Moreau to defeat anyone. If you must replant, do it as if you've never heard the word market. And if you ever pour for those quiet enough to hear what has never been named." Isabel didn't cry. She simply removed her gloves and placed both hands on the stone table, her palms warm the stone still. Then she took the notebook she had brought and laid it beside her grandfather's. She didn't open it. She didn't write anything. She just left it there, as if to say, "I understand, but I will write the next part in my own way." When she climbed out of the cellar, she didn't close the lid. She left it open, not so others could enter, but so memory would no longer be kept locked inside. Outside, the moon was still bright. The breeze was gentle, the grass leaned softly, and the earth seemed to still itself, as if it too had just remembered something it had long forgotten. The following week, the man from Turin returned, this time bringing a printed draft, a detailed proposal to restore the Moreau Vineyard as a living museum, complete with a tasting room, artisanal agronomy workshops, and a storytelling space enhanced with augmented reality. He laid it out on the wooden table carefully, like someone placing an offering. It had no flashy layouts, like the man from Paris had shown, but in every handwritten note, his sincerity was unmistakable. Isabel glanced at it. Quietly, she touched the edge of the page, then asked, "If I agree, What happens to the L12 grape? Turin hesitated. We'd need to crossbreed it to stabilize yield. Maybe register it with an international conservation bank. But you'd still be credited as the one who rediscovered it. Isabel smiled. Gently. Very gently. But it was the kind of smile that comes when someone knows deep down they've just stepped off a path they no longer wish to follow. The next morning, she woke early and went out back where the old vineyard rose had long gone wild. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't ask for help. It was just her hands and the cracked earth. She dug small furrows, not by any farming manual, but by memory, guided by what her grandfather once wrote, "In dry years, plant deeper. In still winds, let the soil speak for itself." Inside a small tin box were seeds of the L12 grape, a variety unnamed by any official plant registry, but still surviving after 3 generations of people who never forced it to bloom on schedule. She didn't plan to win anything. She planned to remember. She planted as though memory too needed light and water, but never a marketing executive. That afternoon, the man from Turin returned. He saw the freshly turned earth. He stood silently for a long time, then asked, "So, you don't need a museum? No restoration project?" Isabel brushed the soil from her hands and sat on the stone steps. "I don't want a place where people come to study history. I want a place where someone can drink what they once believed no longer existed. Not to learn more, but to remember." He nodded. He said nothing else. Moments later, he stood up, placed something gently on the old wooden table, and walked away. It was an empty glass bottle. No label. Just one line, written in violet ink on a slip of paper, taped to it, "If it ever fills again, please don't classify it." Isabel watched him disappear down the path. Then she turned back, holding the last seed in her palm. The sun was beginning to set behind the tiled roof, and the wind moved softly across the vineyard, like an answer no one needed to say aloud. Winter came early. The wind had begun to whistle across the tiled roof. The young L12 sprouts, though not yet strong, held their ground against the cold. She didn't cover them, didn't build a frost frame. She let them learn resilience on their own, the same way her grandfather had once left it for her. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the kitchen door and landed on the old wooden table, Isabel poured herself a small glass from the first batch of wine. It wasn't a commercial bottle, nor a tasting session, just a chipped porcelain cup placed by the window where the sunlight was still warm enough to dry the things left unsaid. She lifted the cup not to drink, but to look. The wine wasn't clear, like market-grade whites. It was slightly dark, cloudy, like slowly fermented grape juice, glowing faintly like red soil after rain. The first scent was dried apple skin, then a hint of hearth smoke, and finally, something else. Something that had no name. Not fragrant, but familiar. Like the smell of an old coat after a long train ride. Like the scent of someone who had left, but whose name still lingered in the kitchen. She didn't sip it right away. She just set the cup down and watched the steam rise like the smoke of a farewell no one could bring themselves to speak aloud. Then she picked up her pen, opened a blank page, and wrote the first line in a new notebook. I didn't hold on to the name Moreau to be the last one. I kept it, so that one day the first person after me wouldn't have to start from nothing. A few days later, someone came by. An elderly woman from the neighboring village was carrying a small cloth bag and 2 hands weathered with cracks. She didn't ask to buy. She just sat down and said she had once worked for Gervais as a helper at 16, but was fired for saying his wine smelled like burnt grass. They both laughed. laughed like time hadn't taken anything, just changed the shape of memory. Isabel poured herself a glass. No explanations, no mention of L12, no mention that it was the first batch. She just poured. The old woman sniffed it and took a sip, paused. She didn't say it was good. She didn't critique it. She only said, it tastes like someone who was never forced to be on time. Isabel bowed her head. That was the acknowledgement she had waited 10 years for, not from experts, but from someone who once believed she didn't matter. There was no signboard, no guest list, no one live streaming. Just an unlabeled glass of wine and a woman pouring it with hands that once dug through the earth in silence. A memory came back, not through triumph, not through argument, but through a single sip, just enough for someone to feel they still belonged. One woman walked into a room she wasn't on the guest list for and made the entire system bow its head. Another stepped into a cellar buried for 80 years and poured memory back one drop at a time. Two women, two opposite journeys. One reclaimed her name beneath a spotlight, the other whispered aloud what her ancestors never dared to say. One silenced an entire room with a single question. The other brought a forgotten grape back to life with a hand still stained with earth. One won by staying silent at the exact right moment. The other won by refusing to turn memory into a product. And both of them chose not to take revenge. They chose to remember. The first story reminds us justice, even when delayed, must still arrive, because there are injustices that need to be named, exposed, and overturned right where others once laughed at you. The second story reminds us not every victory needs an audience. Some things, if you're quiet enough to protect them, will continue to live even when the world has forgotten. What's the lesson here? That real value doesn't lie in noise, but in the quiet resolve of those who continue doing the right thing even when no one's watching. That legacy is not something to be rebranded, amplified, or priced for the market. Legacy is sometimes just a notebook with fading ink, an unlabeled bottle of wine, or a promise never spoken out loud. And that there are women who don't stand out in the way the market expects, but who manage to name the things society tried hardest to forget. My personal view, I believe that in a world where everything can be packaged, labeled, sold, and declared a success, people like Isabel or the woman in the auction hall are the reason the world doesn't entirely drift into amnesia. They don't fight the system by destroying it. They simply remind us that silence has its own sound, and that no valuation will ever measure the worth of a memory kept at the right time. If stories like these resonate with you, if you've ever felt cast aside, misnamed or forgotten in a world moving too fast, then stay with Toch Story. This is where we tell the stories people once thought were small, unremarkable, or worthless. Stories that were never printed on labels, stories that didn't have good market value, but carried real, enduring worth. Click follow, not to stay updated on our latest videos, but to remind yourself some stories deserve to be poured again, one drop at a time.